The letter came from the War Department on a Tuesday. Young Vernon Baker stared at the words on the page. His future suddenly compressed into stark black and white. Drafted. He was going to war. The year was 1941, and America was gearing up for a conflict that would engulf the world. But for Baker and thousands of other black Americans, this call to arms came with an asterisk, a footnote, a bitter understanding that they would serve a country that refused to serve them. We weren't fighting one war, Baker would later recall, his voice weathered by time but not by doubt. We were fighting two, one against the enemy overseas and another against prejudice at home. As Baker folded that draft letter and tucked it into his pocket, he couldn't have known that he and his fellow soldiers would write one of the most extraordinary chapters in American military history, one that would remain buried in the shadows for decades. Dawn broke cold and gray over the Italian countryside on April 5, 1945. Lieutenant Vernon Baker of the 370th Infantry Regiment, 92nd Infantry Division, the Buffalo Soldiers, peered through binoculars at Castle Aganolfi, a medieval fortress perched atop a jagged ridge. The stone behemoth had been converted into a German stronghold, bristling with machine guns, mortars, and observation posts that commanded every approach. Military strategists called it impregnable. Baker's white commanding officers had already concluded that black troops couldn't possibly take such a formidable position. "We'll need to wait for reinforcements," a white staff officer had insisted the night before. The unspoken message hung in the air. Black soldiers lacked the courage, the discipline, the basic human capacity to accomplish something this difficult. Baker lowered his binoculars and looked at the men around him. They were exhausted, having fought their way up the Italian peninsula for months. They had endured not just the German bullets and the frigid mountain passes, but the constant drumbeat of doubt from their own military leadership. They had been segregated, under-equipped, and repeatedly told, sometimes subtly, sometimes explicitly, that they weren't real soldiers. 3 months earlier, the division's white commander, Major General Edward Allman, had told a reporter, "These men lack the intelligence, courage, and leadership to fight effectively in combat." Single quotes now. On this cold Italian morning, Baker's men huddled close. They weren't supposed to be here. They weren't supposed to be capable of what they were about to attempt, but that's exactly why they had to try. "We move in 10 minutes, Baker whispered. What happened next would rewrite military history if anyone had bothered to record it. The story of black Americans in World War II isn't just a footnote to history. It's an epic saga of heroism under fire and dignity under duress. It's the story of men who fought with exceptional valor despite being told, at every turn, that they weren't worthy of wearing the uniform. When America entered World War II in December 1941, its military was as segregated as the Jim Crow South. Black soldiers were relegated to separate units, typically led by white officers. Most were assigned to service roles, cooking, cleaning, driving trucks, based on the military's assessment that black Americans lacked the mental capacity and courage for combat. The Army brass had a saying, recalled Howard Perry, who served with the 761st Tank Battalion, the famed Black Panthers. They'd say, "Negroes can't fight. They don't have the nerve for it." And this wasn't just talk among the ranks. This was official military doctrine. Single quotes the U.S. Army War College had produced a report in 1925 concluding that black soldiers were inherently cowardly and incapable of handling complex machinery. A document that continued to influence military thinking well into the 1940s. Black Americans who volunteered for combat roles found themselves shuttled into labor battalions instead, building roads, unloading ships, and burying the dead. Yet as the war intensified and casualties mounted, necessity began to challenge prejudice. By 1944, the military reluctantly formed a handful of all-black combat units, including the 761st Tank Battalion, the 92nd Infantry Division, and the 332nd Fighter Group, better known as the Tuskegee Airmen. "They didn't want us there," said Alexander Jefferson, a Tuskegee Airman. "They didn't think we could fly planes. They set up the program expecting us to fail, but they didn't fail. Instead, they excelled, often spectacularly, and in doing so, they didn't just fight the war. They changed the very institution that had tried to diminish them." The 761st Tank Battalion thundered across Europe in their Sherman tanks, smashing through German defenses with such ferocity that General George Patton, initially skeptical, declared, "I have never seen finer soldiers." In 6 months of continuous combat, the Black Panthers helped liberate 30 towns, captured 30 major enemy guns, and destroyed 6 tanks and 650 wheeled vehicles, while taking heavy casualties. The Tuskegee Airmen, the Red Tails, as they were known for the distinctive paint on their P-51, Mustangs compiled one of the most impressive combat records in the European theater, flying more than 15,000 sorties and earning 3 distinguished unit citations. They destroyed 112 enemy aircraft and damaged another 150, all while escorting bomber crews with a nearly unblemished protection record. "We were constantly under the microscope," said Charles McGee, who flew 137 combat missions with the Tuskegee Airmen. "Every mission, every engagement, we knew that if we failed, it wouldn't just reflect on us as individuals. They'd use it as proof that the entire race wasn't fit for combat." The pressure was crushing, yet instead of buckling, these men soared. But nowhere was the burden of proof heavier than on the infantrymen of the 92nd Division. Activated in October 1942 and sent to Italy in 1944, the Buffalo Soldiers found themselves in some of the most brutal fighting of the war, battling up the Italian boot against elite German units dug into mountainous terrain. And they did so under a commander, Major General Edward Almond, who made little secret of his belief that his own men were inferior. "They were set up to fail from the beginning," said historian Daniel Gibran, who has extensively studied the 92nd. "They were given the toughest assignments with the least preparation and the poorest equipment. And when they stumbled, as any unit would under those conditions, it was blamed on their race rather than the circumstances." Despite these challenges, the Buffalo Soldiers captured hundreds of square miles of enemy territory and took more than 20,000 German prisoners. Individual soldiers performed acts of heroism that, had they been white, would have immediately earned them the nation's highest decorations. Men like John Fox, a forward artillery observer with the 366th Infantry Regiment, who called in artillery fire on his own position during the German counteroffensive at Soma Colonia in December 1944, sacrificing his life to halt the enemy advance, or Vernon Baker, who single-handedly destroyed 6 machine gun nests, killed 11 enemy soldiers, and led his heavily outnumbered company in capturing Castle Aganulfi, a feat that military strategists had deemed impossible. For these actions, Baker would wait 52 years to receive the Medal of Honor. Fox would wait 53 years, and his would be awarded posthumously. This is their story, not just of battles won and lost, but of dignity maintained in the face of staggering injustice. It's a story that America was slow to acknowledge, but one that changed the nation forever. As we begin, let us return to that cold morning in Italy, where Lieutenant Vernon Baker and his men are about to attempt the impossible. The fog hung low over the Ligurian coast as Baker led his platoon through the pre-dawn darkness toward Castle Aganulfi. The German fortress loomed 1,500 feet above them, its stone walls blending with the granite mountainside. Intelligence reports indicated the position was held by at least a battalion of German troops with interlocking fields of fire covering every approach. The night before, Baker had studied the worn topographical map by flashlight, identifying a narrow ravine that might provide cover for an initial advance. It was a desperate gamble. Previous attacks by white units had been repulsed with heavy casualties. "We don't have a choice," Baker had told his men. "We've been ordered to take it, so we'll take it." What he didn't say was what they all knew, that failure would be used as evidence that black soldiers couldn't fight. Success, on the other hand, would likely be attributed to luck, or worse, claimed by white officers further up the chain of command. Baker, a 25-year-old from Cheyenne, Wyoming, had volunteered for the Army in 1941, dreaming of being a military policeman. Instead, the recruiters had directed him to the colored infantry. 4 years later, he found himself leading men into combat in the segregated army, where even getting ammunition resupplied required overcoming racial barriers. As they began their ascent in the gathering light, Baker signaled for his men to spread out. They moved silently, their breaths visible in the cold morning air. The first rays of sunlight had just crested the mountains when a German machine gun opened fire, the bullets chewing into the earth around them. "Take cover," Baker shouted, diving behind a rock outcropping. The ravine that had promised protection now felt like a trap. Machine gun fire raked their position from multiple angles. Several of Baker's men were hit in the initial burst, their cries adding to the chaos. Baker crawled forward to get a better view. Through a gap in the rocks, he spotted the first machine gun nest about 100 yards up the slope. Without hesitation, he sprinted across open ground, zigzagging as bullets kicked up dirt around his feet. Reaching a position just below the German emplacement, he pulled the pin on a grenade, counted to 3, and hurled it over the stone wall. The explosion was followed by screams. Baker vaulted over the wall, his M1 carbine at the ready, and found 3 German soldiers sprawled beside their damaged weapon. 2 were dead, the third reached for a pistol. Baker fired twice. Signaling his men forward, Baker continued up the slope. Over the next hour, he personally destroyed 3 more machine gun positions. each time crawling close enough to use grenades before finishing the job with his carbine. His men followed his example, gradually working their way up the ridge despite taking casualties. By mid-morning they had reached the castle's outer walls, but the cost had been high. Of the 25 men who had started the assault, only 7 remained unwounded. Running low on ammunition and grenades, Baker knew they couldn't hold if the Germans launched a determined counterattack. He made a quick decision. Jackson Peterson, he called the 2 of his remaining men. Get back down to the rally point. Tell them we've reached the objective but need reinforcements and ammunition immediately. As his messengers disappeared down the slope, Baker organized his remaining men into a defensive perimeter. They used the Germans' own machine guns, turning them around to cover the likely approaches for a counterattack. An hour passed, then another. The expected German counterattack never materialized. Many of the defenders had fled when they realized their position was being overrun, but neither did the promised reinforcements arrive from the American lines. "Sir," one of Baker's men finally said, pointing down the slope, "I think I see movement." Baker raised his binoculars. Through the trees he could make out olive-drab uniforms moving cautiously up the hillside, but as they drew closer, his momentary relief turned to confusion. "Those aren't our reinforcements," he said quietly. "That's a white officer's reconnaissance patrol," the patrol's leader, a captain from division headquarters, seemed equally surprised to find Baker and his men already holding the castle. His first words were not congratulations, but an incredulous, "How the hell did you get up here?" Later that night, as Baker's exhausted men were finally relieved, he learned that their success was already being rewritten. The division's after-action report would credit the castle's capture to elements of the 370th Infantry, with no mention of Baker or the fact that an all-black platoon had accomplished what white units had failed to do. I wasn't surprised, Baker would recall decades later. That's just how it was. We were invisible men even when we bled. The battle for Castle Agenolfi was just one of countless episodes during World War II where black soldiers exceeded expectations only to have their achievements minimized or erased. The pattern was so consistent that it could only be deliberate, a systematic effort to preserve the myth of white superiority even as black Americans were disproving. It dailied on the battlefield. The 761st Tank Battalion, the first black armored unit to see combat in World War II, encountered similar treatment after being attached to Patton's Third Army in France in November 1944. Despite Patton's initial skepticism, he had opposed using, quote, black units in combat. The tankers' performance quickly earned his respect. "Men, you're the first Negro tankers to ever fight in the American Army," he told them before their first action. "I would never have asked for you if you weren't good. I have nothing but the best in my army. I don't care what color you are, as long as you go up there and kill those Kraut sons of bitches." The Black Panthers took Patton at his word. On November 7, 1944, they spearheaded an attack on the French town of Morville-les-Vicq, facing intense German resistance. When the lead tank was knocked out by an anti-tank weapon, Sergeant Reuben Rivers dismounted despite enemy fire, attached a cable from his tank to the roadblock, and dragged it aside so the column could continue. "We didn't have time to think about making history," recalled Staff Sergeant Floyd Dade of the 761st. "We were too busy trying to stay alive and do our job." For 183 consecutive days, a record for any American armored unit, the Black Panthers remained in continuous combat, fighting through France, Belgium, and into Germany. They participated in 4 major Allied campaigns, including the Battle of the Bulge, where they helped break through German lines to relieve the besieged town of Bastogne. Their losses were staggering: 36 men killed, 260 wounded, and 60 tanks lost to enemy fire. Their achievements were equally impressive. They helped liberate more than 30 towns, captured 98 enemy tanks and armored vehicles, 1,500 horses, 64 tons of enemy ammunition, and more than 400 prisoners of war. Yet after the war, they returned to an America that remained segregated and hostile. Staff Sergeant Johnny Stevens of the 761st recalled an incident that crystallized the bitter irony of their situation. Returning home through Texas by train, Stevens and other black veterans were ordered to give up their seats to German prisoners of war. "Here we were, American soldiers who had fought for our country," Stevens said, "and they were telling us to stand so that German posts could sit down." That's when I knew that nothing had really changed. Similar indignities awaited the Tuskegee Airmen, whose aerial prowess had demolished the myth that black Americans couldn't master complex machinery or perform under pressure. The 332nd Fighter Group had compiled a remarkable record: 15,500 combat sorties, 112 enemy aircraft destroyed in the air, another 150 on the ground, and an exemplary record of protecting the bombers they escorted. They earned 3 distinguished unit citations. One for a mission where they shot down 3 advanced German Me-262 jet fighters while escorting bombers to Berlin. Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., the commander of the 332nd and one of the first black graduates of West Point, insisted on the highest standards. "We were not just fighting the Germans," he said. "We were fighting for the right to fight as equals." Yet when the Red Tails returned to American soil, they faced the same segregated facilities and second-class citizenship as before. At Freeman Field in Indiana, black officers were barred from the White Officers Club despite regulations entitling all officers to such facilities. When more than 100 of them attempted to enter in peaceful protest, they were arrested, a stark reminder that even in victory, equality remained elusive. For the infantrymen of the 92nd Division, the contradictions were perhaps most acute. Fighting in the rugged mountains of northern Italy, they faced some of Germany's most elite units, including the 16th SS Panzer Grenadier Division. They did so under the command of General Edward Almond, whose prejudice against his own men was an open secret. "The general problem with Negro soldiers has always been simply that they are given a mission and they fail," Almond wrote in one report. "It is my opinion that the Negro does not have the mental or emotional stability or the physical stamina for combat." Yet when the Buffalo Soldiers broke through the Gothic Line, a series of German fortifications that had stalled the Allied advance for months, Almond was quick to claim credit while attributing any setbacks to the supposed limitations of his men. The truth was far different, as evidenced by men like Lieutenant John Fox. On December 26, 1944, Fox was serving as an artillery observer in the Italian village of Semocolonia when German forces launched a massive counterattack. As they overran the village, Fox remained in his observation post on the second floor of a house, calling in artillery fire with increasing precision as the enemy closed in. "The Germans are almost on top of me," he radioed back to the artillery unit. "Bring the fire on my position." The officer on the other end was incredulous. "There's 1,000 Germans out there, Lieutenant. If we drop artillery on your position, you won't survive." "I know," Fox replied calmly. "Fire it anyway. There are more of them than there are of me." The artillery officer gave the order. Shells rained down on Semocolonia, killing Fox but halting the German advance. When Allied forces retook the village days later, they found Fox's body surrounded by approximately 100 German dead. For this supreme act of self-sacrifice, Fox was awarded nothing. No Silver Star, no Distinguished Service Cross, certainly not the Medal of Honor. In fact, his heroism went unrecognized for more than half a century. The same was true for Vernon Baker, despite single-handedly destroying 6 German machine gun nests and killing 11 enemy soldiers at Castel-Laganolfi. He received a Distinguished Service Cross. Significant, but not the Medal of Honor his actions warranted. "I didn't expect anything more," Baker would later say. "Not then. Not for us." Indeed, of the 433 Medals of Honor awarded during World War II, not a single one went to a black soldier, despite more than 1 million black Americans serving in uniform. The message was clear: no matter how courageous, no matter how skilled, her service would always be considered second class. But while the military establishment might have been willing to overlook their achievements, history has been more just. In 1993, the Army commissioned a study to determine whether black soldiers had been unjustly denied the nation's highest military decoration. The conclusion was unequivocal: racism had played a role in denying them recognition. In January 1997, more than 5 decades after the war's end, President Bill Clinton presented the Medal of Honor to 7 black World War II veterans or their families. Only Vernon Baker was still alive to receive it in person. "This ceremony is about never giving up," Clinton said at the White House. "It's about the fact that there are those who refuse to let their dream die." Standing before the president, the 77-year-old Baker thought of his comrades who hadn't lived to see this day. "I was a soldier," he said simply, "and I served my country as best I knew how." The delayed recognition of these black heroes tells us something profound about America, both its capacity for injustice and its potential for redemption. The same nation that segregated its military and denied black soldiers their rightful honors eventually, if belatedly, acknowledged its mistake. This delayed justice doesn't erase the original wrong, but it does point to a hard-won progress. The achievements of the Buffalo Soldiers, the Black Panthers, and the Tuskegee Airmen helped pave the way for President Harry Truman's Executive Order 9981, which desegregated the armed forces in 1948. Their example made it increasingly difficult to maintain the fiction that black Americans were somehow less capable, less courageous, or less committed to their country. In the crucible of combat, they had demonstrated not just equal but often superior skill and valor. They had done so despite serving in a segregated military that provided them with inferior equipment, inadequate training, and leadership that sometimes seemed determined to see them fail. And in doing so, they had helped to begin the long, unfinished process of making America live up to its founding promise of equality. The story of black units in World War II is more than a military narrative. It's a testament to the human spirit's capacity to maintain dignity in the face of dehumanization. It's about men who fought for a freedom they themselves had never fully experienced, who loved a country that often refused to love them back. "We were fighting for the right to be treated like men," said William Perry, who served with the 761st. "We were fighting for the right to be seen as Americans." Plain and simple. Their battlefield achievements eventually forced a reckoning within American society. If black men could fight and die with such distinction in defense of democracy abroad, how could democracy continue to deny them basic rights at home? The question hung in the air as veterans returned, creating an uncomfortable cognitive dissonance that helped fuel the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. Many veterans of these segregated units went on to become leaders in that movement. Men like Dory Miller, a Navy mess attendant who shot down 4 Japanese planes during the attack on Pearl Harbor before being killed later in the war. Or Medgar Evers, who served with the 325th Port Company in Europe before returning home to become a civil rights activist in Mississippi, where he was eventually assassinated. These men understood something profound, that their service had given them a moral authority that couldn't be dismissed. They had proven their worth in the most demanding circumstances imaginable. They had answered their country's call despite its mistreatment of them. And in doing so, they had earned the right to demand that America live up to its ideals. "After you've faced bullets wearing your country's uniform," said Charles Young, a veteran of the 92nd Division, "it's hard to accept being treated like you're not a full citizen." The legacy of these units extends beyond their immediate achievements. They didn't just help win a war, they helped change a nation's understanding of itself. They demonstrated that courage, skill, and patriotism aren't the province of any one race, that human potential transcends the artificial boundaries we construct. In the decades since World War II, the U.S. military has evolved from a segregated institution to one of the most integrated in American society. Black Americans have risen to its highest ranks, serving as generals, admirals, and eventually as Secretary of Defense. This transformation didn't happen by accident. It was forged in places like Castle Agonolfi, the Ardennes Forest, and the skies over Berlin, where black soldiers proved not just their equality but their excellence. Vernon Baker lived to see much of this change. After receiving the long-delayed Medal of Honor in 1997, he continued to speak about his experiences until his death in 2010 at the age of 90. He never expressed bitterness about the belated recognition, only satisfaction that the truth had finally been acknowledged. "The only thing that matters," he once said, "is that we did our job. We did what they said we couldn't do, and no one can ever take that away from us. Indeed, no one can." The achievements of these segregated units stand as a powerful rebuke to the racism that necessitated their creation. They demonstrated that the artificial constraints of prejudice are just that, artificial, when given the opportunity, even in the most adverse circumstances. Black soldiers displayed the full spectrum of human potential: courage, intelligence, leadership, and sacrifice. Their story reminds us that heroism knows no color line, and that those who defend freedom deserve to share in it fully. It's a lesson as relevant today as it was in the crucible of World War II. As we reflect on their legacy, perhaps the most fitting tribute is to recognize that their fight continues. The battle against prejudice and for full equality remains unfinished, both within the military and in American society at large. By remembering the Buffalo Soldiers, the Black Panthers, and the Tuskegee Airmen, by telling their stories truthfully and completely, we honor not just their past achievements, but their ongoing contribution to a more perfect union. In the end, they didn't just prove that black units could fight, they proved that the human spirit can triumph over hatred and bigotry, that dignity can survive even the most dehumanizing conditions. And in doing so, they didn't just help save democracy, they helped to expand it. That is their enduring legacy. That is their gift to us all. If this story moved you, please take a second to like this video. It truly helps us keep these untold stories alive. Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel to discover more real stories of black heroes whose courage changed the course of history.